So what is postcolonialism and how does it relate to, well, so many of the texts that you will be studying in the English syllabus? So postcolonialism is basically a term that came about in the 1980s that really challenged the traditional histories and the perspective that stories, theatre productions, and basically, well, I said history was told prior to that time. So when we think about, what came before post-colonialism, obviously it was colonialism. So colonialism was basically, at the time where countries such as England and France, they were two really key ones. They were, traveling the world, discovering new places, and basically, claiming that land as their own. So let's use Australia as a really good, relatable example. So the British came here, colonized, and proclaimed that the land was terra nullius, so nowhere, it doesn't belong to anyone, and so basically just not acknowledging the indigenous population that were here first. And so what happens in that regard is that there's a particular history that's told, there's particular education that is taught about the beginning of this country and, how we came about. But what it did was it ignored that previous history and the culture and the rich traditions of that indigenous population that came well before, the English colonizers actually came to these shores. So what we're kind of looking at here is that, there's a perspective that has really shifted and is now very much a part of the world, the context we live in. And when you think about what happened back then, there was a real sense that the people that lived here originally, their stories were never told. We didn't, there was no knowledge of what was actually really going on with, particularly the dehumanization of them. They became a minority group and, ultimately voiceless. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't communicate and share their stories and their side. And a big part of that is because they didn't have the language to do so. And so it's really only once people from the indigenous or these minority groups could have the language to challenge and tell a different story that things started really shifting, which is ironic because that's a process of even assimilation, to have to learn the language to be able to tell your story. In many ways, losing their own language and their own culture in the interim. Also there was just an inability to kind of fight back because of the superior technology and whatnot that the British did have. So when we're looking at what happened in that change, we're then moving to this idea of what we call post-colonialism. So that's obviously after colonization, but it's part of the umbrella of postmodernism. So postmodernism, if you look at the previous video, is all about challenging the traditional structures, narratives, ideas, and even representations through art, literature, paintings, etc. All those traditional ideas and ways of doing things. And there's this idea that these previously accepted truths and histories and so forth have been challenged and questioned. And that's what happens through post-colonialism. So yeah, question traditional narratives and histories, arguing against things such as terra nullius and the notion that indigenous peoples were inferior and barbaric culturalists, didn't have, so many of the things that they did in fact have that were totally overlooked and totally disregarded. And so what happened is we start getting a different look at history and what actually happened. So once we start learning about things like the stolen generation, so this is very much what the education system is predicated upon now, which is that we've learned about these things to a much larger degree than say someone had in the 1940s or 50s. We wouldn't have even heard anything about that. It would have just been the accepted narrative that they weren't human beings. The English have done the right thing, etc. So what we now look at is that actually there were a lot of injustices that went on there. So yeah, things like the stolen generation, assimilation, and so many of the racially prejudiced laws and so forth that were practiced during that time post-colonialism. So then once we hit post-colonialism, you start seeing things like poetry and stories and you know, films and like so many other things come out to educate us on that side, that minority, that voice of the other that has previously been silenced and unheard. So, you know, you can see, you know, so much evidence of this in, you know, like what we not only study today, but also in the media, in film, and so forth. So when you're looking at the text that you're doing, if it's representing that voice of the other or the previously silenced minority, that is what postcolonialism, or that's the influence of postcolonialism on our world today.